Hi everybody. In this video I want to talk about how you might organize writing project 3. This is a longer paper, 8 pages minimum by the time it's all said and done, and you're working on your draft for this next module. So I wanted to take a few minutes to just walk you through how to think about organization and a way that you might organize this particular paper. I want to say at the outset that organization, there are some basic traditional organizational patterns for essays, especially argumentative essays. But at the end of the day, organization always depends upon your audience, your purpose, and the actual argument you're making, the question you're writing about. But let's take a look here. Remember, first of all, organization is about the reader. Whatever you're writing about, your goal in thinking about organization is to make sense to your audience. Your ideas have to make sense to your audience, which is true of any communication, because if they don't make sense to your audience, then you have failed to communicate effectively, whether that's in writing or in speech, right? So we want to be effective with our audience. So that means there are lots of different ways to organize a long paper, and they will depend on, in college context, the discipline you're writing in, that is the academic class that you're in, the publication, what kind of publication you might be writing for, whether it's a college paper for a class or a newspaper or an academic journal. Publication type shapes the way we organize. The audience we're writing to is a consideration. Who are we writing to? What do they understand? What do they know? That dictates organization. And our own purposes. Are we writing to simply report information? Are we writing to entertain? Are we writing to persuade? Or do some combination of all of those things? That also dictates organization. In writing project 3, what are some of your purposes? You can have lots of different purposes here, and they will depend on what you want to say. And I want to encourage you to keep in mind that all good writing essentially has to come from you having something you want to say to somebody. If you don't have that, writing becomes a much more difficult proposition. But keeping that in mind, some of your purposes for writing Project 3 will be to help your reader understand the question you have asked and why that question is important. One of your purposes will be to help your reader understand the various ways people might already think about your question or questions like it, because you might be asking a question that other people have already thought about and might have potential answers to. So you might want your readers to understand those other potential answers, even if they may not end up being your own. You'll want to clearly show your reader your answer to the question and show your readers why your answer is reasonable and sensible. To do that, you'll also want to show the evidence that illustrates and supports your answer. And overall, you'll want to help your reader understand why they should even care about the question you've asked and your answer to it. So those are some of your purposes. You may have other ones, but academically and in terms of the outcomes for this class, these are some staple purposes you're going to have for this paper. So I would propose one way to think about organizing your paper, and it's a general, broad way, is think about it with this sample outline in mind. Okay, there are other ways to do this, and I'm going to show you one in another video with more detail in it. But just in general, this 3-part outline I think is pretty sufficient to help you wrap your brain around how to organize your paper. We'll have an opening, which introduces us to the question and why it's important. Notice I'm calling it an opening. The thing you open with. You might call it an introduction, but introduction kind of carries its baggage from high school writing, possibly. That's fine. You can think of it as an introduction, but I'd like to think of it for this video as a broad opening. Introduce us to the question, why it's important. And a middle, which will, of course, be the chunkiest, the biggest part of your paper, and that's where you're going to explain your answer to this question based on your reasons, evidence, and logic. Then some sort of closing, right, which helps your readers understand your essential conclusions, why they should care about why they should care about this topic, why the answer should be convincing to them, why it's convincing to you. In short, a closing that answers the 2 questions: so what and who cares. Let's look at each of these 3 in turn. Your opening should introduce us to the question and why it's important. It can do other things, but this is sort of a key move. To give enough context for your audience to understand where your question came from, what motivated it, and why is it important? Why is it significant? You'll always want to think about your audience's values and assumptions. So keep in mind you're writing for an academic audience. That will include me. It will also include your classmates. And you can think of it more broadly as maybe even other English professors. So keep that broad academic audience in mind. In your opening, you'll probably need to define any key terms you'll be using. Your questions vary. They're as varied and interesting as you are as individuals. So keep in mind, is there special vocabulary or terms you'll need to explain to your readers so they'll understand your question and where it comes from? In some cases, it might be that you've found that other people have provided potential answers to this question. Maybe they're not your answers, but maybe they've come up with their own answers. In that case, this could be a place where you help your readers understand those other potential answers because they are part of the larger conversation that is going on about this question. That's kind of a they-say move, right? What have other people said about this where applicable? And then, of course, you'll want to lead your readers to some sort of clear answer to this question in your opening. That would be your answer to this question. Your thesis, if you will, right? The main answer you have derived after all of your research, your main point, the answer to your question. Now, your middle is, of course, where you explain your answer to this question. You unpack that answer for us based on your reasons, evidence, and logic. So in the middle of your paper, the lion's share portion of your paper, you'll lay out the reasons for your answer. You put those reasons into some sort of logical, audience-friendly order, right? Maybe your answer unfolds in a chronological way. So you need to organize the middle of your paper based on what happened first, next, and last, right? Maybe you have a list of reasons for your answer, and you want to think about organizing your reasons into what seem to be the strongest or most important reasons to maybe the weaker reasons, or possibly the other way around, going from the weaker reasons to the strongest reasons. Maybe you have several points in your answer that are necessary to talk about before talking about other ones. So you want to talk about those first before moving to the other points that depend upon the earlier ones. So you get the idea. Again, think of what's the logic of your answer and how will you need to lay that out for your readers. Of course, think about the meal paragraph for your organization. Meal is hugely important for any kind of argumentative paragraph, right? You need to assert some sort of main claim, provide evidence for it, analyze it, maybe give more evidence for it, and then analyze that evidence, and so forth, and then link it back to your main claim. In the middle of your paper, you want to support your reasons with that clear evidence using the meal paragraph. Remember that readers can't read your mind. You have to anticipate readers' questions and confusions. You've been researching and learning about this question, right? So you know a lot about it by this point, but your readers don't. I guarantee you at this point, for most questions, you know more about the topic than I do, which means you still have to anticipate my questions and confusions as your reader. You need to explain your reasoning, as I've sort of belabored, and you might want to anticipate potential naysayers, that is, potential counter-arguments or objections people might have to your answer, or maybe just alternative points of view people might bring to bear upon your answer. And you can review those by looking at They Say, I Say, Chapter 6 on naysayers. Now, that's a very good little chapter for talking about how you might organize and respond to objections to your claim, to your thesis. Finally, we have the closing, which is where you help your readers understand your essential conclusions. Remember that conclusions, simply put, are all the ideas that you take away from any body of evidence. So I'm looking at a body of evidence. The things that I can deduce, that I can say about what that evidence means, those are my conclusions. So your closing is a good place to sum up those conclusions. In this case, in your writing project, your answer is essentially your major conclusion, but you might have a lot of other conclusions that you draw about your answer as well from the evidence. So this could be a place for them. You want to summarize your answer clearly for the audience, in addition to talking about other conclusions you've drawn. You want to help your reader understand why the question and your answer to it is so important to you. In fact, why the question and answer are so important to you. You want to help your reader understand why they should be significant for your readers. So help us understand why you care about the question and answer if you haven't done so already. Hopefully you have done that earlier in the paper. But also help them understand why we should care. In other words, answer those two fundamental questions. So what? Who cares? We want to know why we should care. And you can look at They Say, I Say, Chapter 7 for a little review on answering those questions. We should be geared up to answer those questions at any point in our writing, but especially in a closing. That can be a good place to really help us understand why we should care about this, right? Why it's important for us to know about it. So hopefully this sort of large three-part organizing structure gives you a sense of how you might organize your paper.